Well, it's a fascinating one. Machiavelli's The Prince. I think this is one of those books that everybody's heard of,
Oh, yeah,
but maybe hasn't actually read.
definitely.
It's a 16th century guidebook for rulers, but still has people talking, debating, arguing even today.
It's one of those works that just seems to transcend time, you know?
Yeah.
And it offers such a raw look at how power dynamics actually work, ambition, and the choices that leaders make. Whether those choices are, always ethical or not is another question.
Yeah, it's like we're getting this peek behind the curtain. We're seeing the gears turning. Let's lay that foundation then. So Machiavelli starts off by categorizing different types of principalities,
Right.
which are basically states ruled by a prince.
Right.
He breaks these down into hereditary, meaning, passed down through the family,
Right.
and new.
Yeah, so those new principalities are fascinating, right? They're like the startups in the world of power. Can be entirely new, maybe like a nation that's formed after a revolution, or they can be acquired by adding territory to an existing state.
Okay. So like when a company acquires a smaller competitor, that's basically them adding a new principality.
Exactly. And then Machiavelli, he goes on to outline the ways that these princes actually acquire power. So he's got personal arms, meaning their own military strength, others' arms. So relying on allies or mercenaries, fortune, which could be anything from pure luck to inheritance, and then, of course, ability. So, skill, intelligence, strategy, all of that.
It's like we're looking at a political game board, and these are the different ways to move your pieces. But I'm guessing some moves are riskier than others.
For sure, for sure. And Machiavelli highlights that. He highlights particularly the challenges of new principalities. And one of the things he points out is that, people are often really eager for change first.
Right.
Right? They're hoping for better conditions under a new ruler. But that initial enthusiasm, it can be very fleeting.
Right. Kind of like when you have a new CEO come into a company and they're like, we're going to change everything.
Yes.
Everyone's all excited. And then it's like, oh, now we're doing all this work.
A new prince needs to be proactive, strategic, even ruthless at times to secure their position and really turn that initial goodwill into some sort of lasting loyalty.
This is making me think of Tony Stark from Iron Man. So he, inherits Stark Industries from his father.
Yeah.
That's the hereditary principality, right?
Right.
But then he goes and builds the Iron Man suit. He starts his own company, and boom, new power dynamic.
He's disrupting the existing power structure.
He's taking that ability and making it into a new kind of power.
And it's about, it's not just about what you inherit, but what you create, right? And Machiavelli gives us a historical example of hereditary power at work. So he talks about the Duke of Ferrara, who successfully withstood all these attacks because his family had ruled for generations. So their power was really, really deeply rooted.
It's almost like they were an established brand.
Exactly.
People knew, people trusted them, they knew what to expect.
Yeah, they had that long-standing reputation. And this makes me think, how does this apply to us?
Yeah.
Like, how do we navigate power shifts in our own lives? Like, think about starting a new job, a new relationship, even joining a new community.
Right.
Those same dynamics are at play.
Yeah. But things I imagine get even more complicated when a prince tries to rule over people with different customs, values, even languages. Machiavelli calls these mixed principalities. And they sound like a breeding ground for conflict.
They are. It's almost inevitable, right? You've got all these different expectations, loyalties, ways of doing things. It's like trying to fit square pegs into round holes.
Right. Kind of like, if you merge two companies that have completely different cultures.
Exactly.
Everyone's speaking a different language, metaphorically, of course.
Right, right. But it creates this potential for resentment, even rebellion, if it's not handled really carefully.
Yeah, that makes me think of the Galactic Empire in Star Wars.
Oh, yeah.
They were constantly struggling to control planets like Lothal, which had this very strong sense of independence.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example because, those rebels on Lothal, they understood that their resources were being plundered. They were being exploited. It's this classic case of a dominant power trying to impose its will on a diverse population. And, history shows us it rarely ends well.
Right. It's almost never a happy ending.
Mm-hmm.
So how are they supposed to navigate that? I mean, Machiavelli must have some advice, right, for dealing with these mixed principalities.
He does. And it's pretty interesting. He actually offers two contrasting approaches. So on the one hand, he suggests that a prince might completely dismantle the existing structure to ensure dominance.
Like burn it all down and start over.
He uses the Romans as an example. They completely destroyed Carthage to eliminate any possibility of future uprisings. It's brutal, but you can't argue with its effectiveness, right?
Right.
And we see that even in, more modern stories like the Hunger Games, right?
Right.
The capital level District 13 to maintain that control.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely one way to do it. But what about the other option?
Yeah, so the other option is a bit more, let's say, less destructive.
Yeah.
And that's to maintain the existing laws and customs, but to eliminate the threat from the previous rulers.
Right.
So he points to France's integration of Brittany and Burgundy as an example of this working, where they essentially kept the existing laws, customs, everything the same, just eliminated the former rulers. And it was a much more, nuanced approach, more about assimilation than annihilation.
So it's like choosing between a hostile takeover or a merger. And each situation would require a different strategy. But wouldn't that also depend on the prince's, let's just say, personality?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where, Machiavelli gets into this idea of a prince's ability. So, their inherent skills and character. And, he even suggests that sometimes a prince needs a bit of fortune, a lucky break, some stroke of genius to overcome those challenges of establishing rule.
It makes me think about, Aragorn from Lord of the Rings. He was the rightful heir, but he was constantly facing challenges to his claim. And it was really through his courage, his wisdom, his strategic alliances that he ultimately, proved himself worthy.
And that's a perfect example because, he had the lineage, but he had that virtue, right? That combination of skill, talent, strength of character, and that really allowed him to lead.
So it's not enough to just be in the right place at the right time. You have to have the skills to capitalize on that.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, where do we see situations like that in our own lives?
Before we dive into, Machiavelli's more controversial ideas about cruelty, let's just kind of recap a little bit. So we've been talking about different types of power structures,
Right.
how those transitions play out even in our own lives, and how a leader's ability, their virtue, is so crucial.
Right. It's not just about being lucky, but having those skills, the character to seize the opportunity. So where does cruelty fit into this?
Well, he argues that, it's good for a prince to be seen as merciful, but that mercy should never undermine his authority. It's better to be feared than loved, but, this is a big but, a prince should avoid being hated at all costs.
Okay, so it's like this balancing act.
Yes.
You need to be tough enough to command respect, but not so cruel that you become a tyrant everyone wants to overthrow. Makes sense in theory.
Yeah.
But how do you actually walk that line?
It's tricky, and Machiavelli uses this fascinating example, Caesar Borgia. So Borgia was notorious for his ruthlessness, but he was also very successful in bringing stability to this region in Italy called Romagna. And Machiavelli contrasts this with the Florentines, whose excessive leniency actually led to chaos and destruction.
So sometimes you need that firm hand.
Yes.
Even if it means making tough, unpopular decisions.
Absolutely. It's like, a surgeon making a really difficult call to save a patient's life.
Right. It's for the greater good. It's making me think about, like, Severus Snape from Harry Potter.
Oh, interesting.
He was harsh, demanding,
Yeah.
even a bit cruel at times,
Right.
But he was also deeply respected by his students. And he really understood the importance of discipline.
Yeah.
You do get the sense with Snape that harsh exterior masked this deeper sense of loyalty and duty.
Yes, exactly. And I think this leads us to a practical takeaway, right? Sometimes being a good leader, it means making those tough calls, even if they're not popular, in the short term. It's about having the courage to do what needs to be done, even if it's not always pleasant.
Makes me think of, like, wartime leaders.
Yes.
Who have to make these really difficult decisions in times of crisis. Churchill during World War II, rallied the British people.
Yeah.
But he also had to make some really tough calls that some might even consider ruthless.
Right.
To secure that victory.
Yeah, absolutely. And it raises this really interesting question for all of us, right? Like, how do we navigate this balance in our own lives? When is it necessary to be firm? To set those boundaries, even if it means, risking being disliked.
Yeah, that's a deep thought. But I want to move on to another kind of controversial aspect of the prince. which is deception. So Machiavelli argues that because people are inherently deceitful and will break their promises, a prince also needs to be willing to use deception when it's necessary.
Yeah, and he's pretty blunt about this. He even points to Pope Alexander VI,
Okay.
who was infamous for, his cunning and his political maneuvering as an example of a leader who was very successful through manipulation. Now, it's important to note, Machiavelli isn't necessarily endorsing this, but he's presenting it as a reality of power.
So that old saying, keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Exactly. You have to know how to play the game, even if the rules are a little bit bendy.
Right. And it reminds me of Walter White.
Oh, interesting.
In Breaking Bad.
Yeah.
He starts out as this mild-mannered chemistry teacher.
Right.
But as he gets deeper and deeper into the drug trade, he becomes this master manipulator and uses deception to protect himself and his empire.
Right, he's got to survive. And it shows how someone can use deception, not necessarily out of malice, but as this survival mechanism in this very cutthroat world.
Yeah. Talk about a transformation. He went from Mr. Chips to Scarface in just a few seasons.
He did. But it raises this important question for us to consider. How much deception, if any, is actually acceptable? Where's the line between strategy and just outright dishonesty, both in our personal lives and in the larger world?
It's tough. It's almost like a moral gray area,
It is. But Machiavelli isn't all about manipulation and ruthlessness. He also emphasizes that a prince should avoid any actions that could lead to being hated or despised.
Okay. So there are limits.
Yes. And it's crucial for a prince, he argues, to maintain some level of public approval. Even if his methods aren't always, let's say, squeaky clean, it's about managing those perceptions, projecting an image of strength and competence.
It's almost like a politician trying to maintain that good public image. You need to be seen as a leader, even if you're making tough choices behind the scenes.
Exactly. And this reminds me of Frank Underwood, House of Cards. Yeah. So ambitious, ruthless, willing to do whatever it takes to climb that political ladder. But he understood public perception. He knew how to maintain that facade of respectability.
Oh, Frank Underwood was a master playing that game. He was charming, charismatic, even when you kind of knew that there were these wheels turning behind those steely eyes.
Yes, but he knew how to play the game. And I think it highlights a really important point. Even if you're playing a Machiavellian game, you have to be aware of how your actions are perceived.
Yeah.
Because if you alienate your allies, if you inspire too much fear or hatred, your power base will crumble.
So it's not enough to just be powerful. You have to be smart about how you wield it.
Absolutely. You have to understand, the optics, the public relations, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. Now, Machiavelli goes on to emphasize this really crucial point. A prince should never rely solely on mercenaries.
Yeah.
Or auxiliary forces.
Okay.
A strong and loyal army is absolutely essential.
So no outsourcing your defense. You need your own team.
You need your own team.
People who are loyal to you and your vision.
Exactly. And he uses the example of the Carthaginians, who were eventually oppressed by their own mercenary armies because they didn't have that core of loyal troops. This makes me think of, Daenerys Targaryen.
Oh, okay.
From Game of Thrones. Powerful leader.
Yeah.
But she relied very heavily on the Dothraki and the Unsullied.
Right.
And ultimately, I think that reliance caused problems.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, her armies were formidable, but there were so many cultural differences, competing interests. It's almost like relying on outside contractors,
Right. They'll do the job, but their loyalty is to the project, not necessarily to your company's long-term vision.
Exactly. And it brings us to this key takeaway, I think. Whether you're building a company, leading a team, even just navigating your own personal life, you need people you can trust.
Right.
People who share your values and are really committed to your success. It's about building that solid foundation, not just relying on temporary alliances or convenient partnerships.
Makes me think about, how we build trust in relationships.
Yeah.
It takes time, effort. A willingness to be vulnerable. It's not something you can just, buy or outsource.
Exactly. And this brings us to another one of Machiavelli's, key insights, which is this interplay of virtue and fortune.
Okay.
He argues that, even if you're lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time, you still need the skills and the character to capitalize on that moment.
Right. It's not enough to just like win the lottery.
Yeah.
You have to know how to manage that. You have to invest it wisely.
Right. And it makes me think about, all those entrepreneurs who have found success. It's rarely just about having a brilliant idea.
Right.
Right. It's about having that grit, that determination, the ability to adapt, to overcome obstacles.
Okay. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here, from ruthlessness and deception, to loyalty and even a bit of luck.
Right.
So what's the core message? What's Machiavelli trying to tell us?
Yeah, I think at its heart, The Prince is really a guide to power.
Oh.
It's this very pragmatic look at how leaders gain and maintain authority, even if those methods aren't always ethical. And it's a text that I think should be read with a critical eye.
Right.
Understanding that the world is complex and there are no easy answers.
So it's not like a how-to manual for being a good person,
Right.
but more like a playbook for understanding how this game is played.
Exactly. And just like in any game, you need to know the rules, even the unspoken ones, if you want to succeed. But, knowing the rules doesn't mean you have to play dirty.
This makes me think about the choices we make every day, even in small situations.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do we navigate our own ambitions and desires for success without compromising our values?
It's a tough one, right? Because knowing the playbook doesn't necessarily mean you have to use every play.
Right, and especially the ones that feel wrong.
Exactly. And I think this brings us back to Machiavelli's idea of virtue.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about skill and cunning,
Right.
but also about strength of character, right?
Right.
A truly effective leader needs to have that moral center, that guiding principle that informs their actions, even the tough ones.
So it's like being a skilled surgeon who also takes an oath to do no harm.
Right, exactly. You have the power to cut, but you use that power ethically and judiciously.
This makes me think of Captain America.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So he's a super soldier with incredible power.
Right.
But he's guided by this very strong moral code. He fights for justice, for what's right, even when it means challenging authority or making these really difficult choices.
Yeah, and I think he embodies that idea of, he's not afraid to get his hands dirty,
Right.
but he's always fighting for the greater good.
Yeah. He's a really good example of virtue in action.
He is. And this brings us to, I think, a really important takeaway, for our listeners. Understanding those power dynamics, even the Machiavellian kind, is valuable. But it's so important to develop your own, moral framework,
Right.
your own guiding principles.
So it's like having a toolbox full of powerful tools.
Right.
But you also need the wisdom to know when and how to use them ethically.
Exactly. Now, it's important to remember that Machiavelli was writing The Prince during a very, very specific time in history.
Yeah.
Italy was in a state of turmoil. It was fractured, vulnerable, and he was really longing for, this strong leader, someone with the virtue to unite the nation and usher in a new era of peace and prosperity.
Makes you wonder, where do we see that need today in the world for that kind of leadership? What situations are calling for that kind of bold action? For a leader who's willing to challenge the status quo, even if it means bending the rules a little bit.
It's a great question. I mean, we live in a very, very complex world, right? And we're facing all these challenges on so many different fronts. Climate change, political polarization, economic inequality, technological disruption. There's no shortage of issues that are demanding really strong and effective leadership.
And sometimes those issues require leaders who are willing to think a little bit differently.
Yeah.
To challenge those conventional ways of thinking, even if it ruffles some feathers.
For sure. Think about someone like Elon Musk or Greta Thunberg. I mean, these are both individuals who are really disrupting existing systems. They're pushing those boundaries, even if their methods are sometimes a little controversial.
It's like they're playing the game, but on their own terms.
Yes, exactly. And I think it speaks to this core message from Machiavelli. Power is this force to be reckoned with, but it's how we wield that power that really matters. We need those leaders who understand how the game is played.
Yeah.
Who are strategic, adaptable, and yes, maybe even a little Machiavellian when necessary.
But also have that moral compass,
Yeah.
that sense of purpose.
Absolutely. It's about finding that balance between pragmatism
Right.
and principle.
Between ambition and integrity.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think ultimately that's the challenge for all of us, right? Not just those in positions of power. It's about understanding these dynamics of influence, persuasion, how to get things done in this world that's, so often messy and unpredictable.
So it's not just about reading The Prince
No.
and learning Machiavelli's strategies.
No.
It's about reflecting on those strategies,
Yeah.
understanding, like, what are the implications of this?
Right.
And then deciding for ourselves how we want to navigate these really complex situations.
Absolutely. And that's the true value, I think, of studying a work like this. It's not a blueprint for ruthless ambition, but it's this mirror that reflects the realities of power and forces us to confront the choices that we make, both big and small, and how those choices actually shape the world around us.
Wow. What a journey. We started with different types of principalities. We ended up talking about, the nature of leadership and
Yeah.
ethics and the challenges that we're all facing in this ever-changing world.
It has been a fascinating exploration, and we hope, our listeners have gained some valuable insights into Machiavelli's ideas and how they can be applied, not just in politics, but also in our personal and professional lives.
Yeah, absolutely. We encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, keep questioning, and keep seeking that balance between pragmatism and principle,
Right. As you navigate your own path to success.
whatever that looks like for you.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Machiavelli's The Prince.
And until next time,
Keep learning
keep growing.
and keep striving to make the world a better place.